You are listening to American Wag, where the mind is respected and the truth is sometimes detected.
That's a joke.
Right.
Well, you know, your uncle always makes a noise when he sits down.
Right.
And another one when he gets up. This one is.
It's actually funny because we've been joking about the fact that both of us are starting to make noises when we get out of the sofa. And Pickles is becoming a funnier comic strip to us every year.
Pickles, I don't know that. You still read the daily newspaper, don't you?
I do, in fact, read a print newspaper. I read 2 print newspapers every day.
Local
A
stuff.
local paper and the Wall Street Journal.
Do you know Jill Lowry?
I know of her. I don't know her. She's the one who wrote Ghetto Side.
Right. Yeah,
She used to be
somebody
for the LA Times.
highly recommended that book to me yesterday.
Insanely highly recommend that book.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I told the person I wasn't really interested in it because, and even though they liked my comment, and we were talking about how black police officers are dealing with the madness.
Yeah, it's very interesting to be a
And,
black police officer today.
And this person who recommended it, I said, for 3 reasons. Number one, I don't like any book that raises interest in black Americans through the lens of crime or IQ or education or economics. I just don't like it. Number two, there were 3 reasons, and the third had something to do with something else, which I can't remember right now.
So, crime is kind of central in a lot of ways to the narrative of race in America, though.
It is.
And fear of crime is kind of central to the narrative of race.
It is.
And what's interesting to me is how Ghetto Side kind of turns our expectations on their head a little bit.
Oh.
And what she talks about is how we have both too much of the wrong kind and not enough policing in poor black neighborhoods. And I tend to generalize because what I believe, since I'm a believer in culture over race, I think the problems of poor black neighborhoods are pretty much similar to the problems of poor brown neighborhoods and poor white neighborhoods. And what we're seeing in the data is that a lot of it overlaps and is very similar, and that there's not a lot that's totally unique in those ways. But what she points out is that one of the things that keeps people from getting a foothold and rising when they're really poor is crime. That if I've got a push cart, if I'm a poor Hispanic selling bacon wrapped hot dogs and I got a push cart, and somebody steals my push cart,
Yep. We're done.
right? That's it, right? It's not like, once you get over a certain level, somebody comes and steals my barbecue or steals my whole house, for that matter, right? I've got insurance up the wazoo. I'll go to the insurance agent, I'll get a check, I'll buy another one, it's over, right? If I'm somebody who's hanging on by my fingernails, right, that kind of loss kind of drives me down. The other thing it does is it builds low trust societies.
Oh, absolutely.
And
that's why they call them hoods, because nobody's neighbors.
That's right. And the reality is that, economic success maps very neatly to high trust. And so how do I build a culture of trust when everybody's worried about literally as well as metaphorically getting a knife stuck in their back?
Well, I think part of the problem is that, and I think it's especially noticeable out here, everything's paved. And one area bleeds into another area, and there's not any real choice about where you live. If you're Mexican, Hispanic, you live in East LA. And East LA goes from, Whittier, Monterey Park, all the east side. If you're Asian, you live in the Valley, Arcadia.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of there's not a whole lot of choice in the matter, and I don't think anybody really knows how to survive a metropolis because my story is there's a second world, and the second world in America doesn't get a whole lot of trust. All right, there should be on TV a lot of shows like Roseanne. There should be a lot of working class TV shows.
Absolutely, there used to be.
And there should be, you know, people should feel about their inner city high schools like Friday Night Lights.
Yep.
There should be a great deal of pride, a great deal of investment in that. And you know, I just spent an hour or so watching police videos, and it's just astonishing the amount that we expect to police and that we really can't.
Well,
and I think as little as I paid attention to the war on drugs and the prison industrial complex, that's a lousy way to get to know, it's a lousy civics lesson.
yeah.
Where you know, everybody's looking for meth, everybody's looking for weed, and people are just getting pulled over, and that's the next thing the officer does.
Yep.
And it's just a lousy way to interact with community. But
Well, it's a lousy way because what it's not about, and it's a lousy way, and there's two legs to it being a lousy way. One leg is, you know, it's incredibly destructive to communities. And my question is, if it was legal, would it be much less destructive? I don't know. Right. But the other part of the problem is that what it means is that every interaction with the police is inherently criminal in intent.
I wonder, you know, how much freedom you can give the meth heads and the crackheads. I mean, if you just say, look, you know that there's meth heads and crackheads in your high school, you know they're trying to sell you, and okay, it's legal. Is that a cancer that will burn itself out, or will it spread?
You know, there's an argument, if you follow kind of the Portuguese model, that you can manage it and control it. I worry a little bit about Portugal because Portugal's drug of choice is basically heroin and cocaine. And it's not meth, it's not crack. And that I think that meth and crack are inherently, you know, there's an old joke, I think from the writer killed his wife in Mexico City in the 30s, trying to shoot a glass off her head. Famous beat writer.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Relatively rich family.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. That's.
But it's the idea that to be a rich, you know, if you're a rich heroin addict, life isn't terrible. It's manageable, right?
That's the whole thing about heroin.
Right. What
You
f's
feel
up
like
what f's up people's lives is that when you're a poor heroin addict, you got to scramble to make $200 a day to handle the habit, and the scrambling is what fucks you up. But I think, you know, the fundamental question is we've generated this world where we have multiple kind of classes of criminality.
Yeah.
And we criminalized, you know, everything, right? We criminalized in some. I was laughing. I read this thing where in Sacramento, it's a criminal offense to work on your own car in your driveway. It's like some kind of misdemeanor.
Right. Could America afford favelas? Could we just let the zoning laws go and have at least corrugated shacks for homeless people, and then the poorest of the poor would just migrate to there, and we could just have like little India style living in the United States of America?
I don't think we could. I think we're going to get it one way or the other. I think it's going to be like Snow Crash, where the hero lives in an old storage building. It's now an apartment building, right? And every time I go to it, we have a storage unit because we're going to do some work on the house. And every time I go to the storage unit, I think about that, right? I think about the fact that there's a world in which this is somebody's living space.
So in that way, American middle class may end up looking like South African middle class, which is, you know, boarded up, gates electrified.
Well, I mean, the problem is, the question is how robust you think the social bonds really are. Because what makes America safe, right, is a behavioral standard that most people hold to. And when a very small number of people break it, it's very manageable.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some tipping point, I believe, where enough people don't hold to it.
Well, I think you will not find a single basketball player, baseball player, or football player in Antifa Black Dog.
Yeah.
These are just radical kids who don't play sports.
Yeah.
Who are not socialized for good sportsmanship or fairness or the ethic of pickup games,
right,
or anything like that.
Right. The ethic of you bring it to a pickup game, but you don't take it too far because, you know, they'll flatten you next time. Right? Or that, you know, you want to be known as somebody who's a good player, but you want to be known as somebody who people want to play with.
Yeah, exactly.
And
even rats know that.
Yeah. And the problem is these kids don't, because everything they've done inside a house over a computer screen through the internet.
So would you have the cops crash them a little bit more, or?
It's an interesting thought. So I know a lot of cops, and I'm old enough to know a lot of old cops. And one of the big changes in policing, one of the many, is that street justice is now no longer legal.
Mm.
And street justice is kind of the good thumping. So
Yeah.
to tell a story, I used to be one of the kids who raced cars on Mulholland late at night.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting at Mulholland in one of the parking little lots, and I'm talking to some other guy, and cops show up, and they're like, they do their standard thing, which is they separate us, and they do FI cards on both of us,
Mm-hmm.
right, field interrogation cards, so they can recognize us in our cars.
Yep.
And I'm talking to my cop, and it's a pretty friendly conversation because I've been well trained in how to talk to cops even
Mhm.
at a young age. And
It's
we're
good skill.
and he's basically talking about, like, look, you're a smart kid, why are you doing this, blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, the other cop takes the other kid, who's, you know, 15 feet away from us, pivots him around and goes, donk, with his head on the hood of his car.
Yep. Yep.
And my cop looks at me and I go, tell me what you want me to do. And he says, stay here. And I go, not moving, right?
Yep. Yep.
Other cop walks over, they cuff the kid, they put him in the back of the patrol car, you know, they sit there, they radio, they talk, they do a bunch of stuff. I'm just literally standing there.
Right. Yeah. No street justice.
Right? Cop comes back, they unhook the kid, get him out of the car, wag fingers at him, drive away, wag fingers at me, drive away, and that's it.
Yeah.
Kid's got a bloody nose. I walk over, and I go, what the hell, dude? And he goes, well, where the fuck were you? I go, what was I supposed to do? and I go, what happened? He goes, I called the guy a fucking pig, and then he smashed my face on the hood of my car.
Oh, jeez.
And I started laughing, and I'm like, what did you think was going to happen here, right? And
Yeah.
but it's one of these things where the police had a bunch of non-administrative solutions to problems.
Mm-hmm.
And they clearly abused the fuck out of them, right? They're clearly a bunch of poor black and brown kids who got a whack from a stick when it
Well, that's
wasn't
still the
called for.
case. That's still the case. You know, the cops get physical with the black sort and the brown sort.
Yeah, but there's an interesting thought on that. I was talking to one of my cop friends about it, and I have no data. It's a thought. It's not a proposal, but it'd be fun to look at the video for data. Because what my cop friend told me, because I talked about that study with him, he says, yeah, it makes total sense. I said, why? He says, because black and brown people front off on cops more.
Yeah, they do. I mean, it's kind of like, it's interesting because I remember just recently somebody on Facebook said, asked the question, when was the first time you had a black male teacher?
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, geez. I mean, for me, it was the 8th grade, and not counting my dad.
Yeah.
Some people were like, oh, second year in college.
Yeah.
It's just like a totally alien experience for a lot of people. And there is street smarts. And so there is a way for you to negotiate with knuckleheads if you grow up around them.
Yep.
And you know that. And it's a specific protocol. But a lot of that extends beyond the streets into jail.
Yep.
So there are people who know what, you know, a jail-bound kid or an ex-gangbanger, how they behave on the streets. And for me, I still see this because there was a recent LAPD thing where they had a couple video camera angles of a guy who responded to a homeless question.
Yeah.
And he roused the guy off the property because he got a call. He says, "There's somebody on my property. He's intimidating me. I don't like it.
Yeah.
Will you please get him out of here?" And he says, "Get on out of here." So the guy walks down half a block with his bicycle, and then he leaves the bike, turns around, and starts walking back to the cop. And I'm like, "Oh, here we goes." And I knew it was going to happen. And the cop thumps him, puts him up against the fence, and it's like he knows technically that he's not resisting, that he's following the instruction, but he's like, "You don't know me.
Yeah.
You don't know who you hit." And it's like, yeah, you punk.
No, but that's
But this guy is up for administrative review.
And so the issue is that what you see, there's a great writer. So a guy who just died named William April, Aprill.
And I think that was Burroughs that you were thinking about.
Yeah, it was Burroughs. Guy just died named William April, who was a clinical psychologist who used to be a prison guard and who teaches and writes a lot about sort of violence. And I took a class from him, and he turned me on to a writer named Lonnie Atherton, who wrote some somewhat controversial books about the creation of violent criminal actors. And his argument is that people like this are created by the culture they grow up in. And the culture you grow up in is one in which dominance is enforced with beatdown.
Yeah.
And they did a study that was really interesting in England, proving this isn't just a phenomenon of American poor black people or brown people. And what they found was that in England, a small group of people were the victims of like 80% of the violent crime in a neighborhood. That these kids, these men and women, these boys and girls, were the ones who got beaten down all the time. And so the issue is that if you live in a neighborhood like that, you've got two choices. You can take the beating or you can give the beating.
Yeah.
Right? And if you're the person who takes the beating, then you're always going to get your ass whipped. Right? Because anytime somebody has a bad day, you walk by, oh, there he is, boom. Right? And so what you build is you build a set of like social and cultural reflexes, which are about, I'd rather get the shit kicked out of me fronting somebody, because that means that they probably won't come back and do it again, than cowering or being compliant.
Right.
And so nice middle class white boy me, right, stands there with the cop talking to him about don't be a street racer. And I'm like, yes, officer, I understand your point, officer. I think I'm behaving in a safe way, but I understand what you're talking about. I'm being the most compliant person that cop's ever seen. Right. The other guy, who was also white, right, is somebody who's like not going to take shit from no cop.
Right.
And calls him fucking pig and gets his head bounced off the hood of the car.
Right. And I think Officer Clancy has a little bit more sense than that, and he knows when he needs to bounce somebody's head off the roof. And when to just say, look, kid, don't let me see you around here again.
Right.
And there's too many cops, and you can't measure cops' character. This is just like modern, interchangeable cops.
Right.
In a modern, interchangeable inner city.
So
and the formula is already written.
And the formula's written, but part of the issue is, like, I've watched way more videos of police shootings than I ever wish I had. And one of the things that you see that's really interesting in them is they almost always begin with ignoring what the cop says, right? Come stand over here. I'm going to walk over here. Come stand over here. There's just a video which I thought was sadly amusing. Some woman gets pulled over by Border Patrol, and they want to search her car for drugs. And she's like, you don't have a warrant. And they go, we believe you're suspicious because of A, B, C, D, which meets our criteria.
Right.
So we're going to wait here for the canine unit to inspect your car. And she's like, well, I'm not going to wait. And the guy goes, look, you're welcome to go. I'm not detaining you. I'm detaining your car. They're in the middle of nowhere. You want to take a walk, go take a walk, right? And she's, being super belligerent. The classic, I'm videoing you and I'm being super belligerent
yes.
person
I'm
to
a
the
sovereign
cops.
citizen.
And the cop's like, look, go stand over there and do whatever you want. but you need to stand over there.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, I'm not standing over there. And there's a female officer who was the first one dealing with her, and her supervisor who walked over.
Right.
And the supervisor just starts walking the woman forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chest out, walking her forward.
Yep.
And the woman shoves him. Whereupon the female officer apparently tases her, because the next thing you see is the camera on the ground with the woman screaming, get that off me, get that off me, right? But it's the, there's a fundamental kind of wiring that goes on about non-compliance that I think leads to more violence.
Yes, and what's interesting is I wrote an essay about this where I'm talking about the myth of senseless violence. There's no such thing as senseless violence. Only psychopaths engage in senseless
And there's very few psychopaths in the world.
Right. Everybody has a reason for the violence they're ready to perpetrate.
Yeah.
Everybody. It's just that these reasons are out of balance when it comes to, the official reasons that a cop has.
Right.
And the presumption of a monopoly on violence. I don't think cops should have a monopoly on violence. We proxy that to the cops. And it's reasonable to object. It's reasonable to fight with cops under certain circumstances. But you have to realize that you're not going to win. And you have to realize that there's more danger in that than you might suspect.
And I mean, look, my thing with my kids when they were coming up was always, there will be a day when you're going to get pulled over by a cop and you're fucked, right? Because you got drugs in the car, because you've been smoking pot, because you're with a naked 15-year-old girl, whatever the reason is that you're being pulled over. Mm-hmm. And I'm pissed at you about why you got pulled over, because that means you were stupid to begin with.
Right.
But don't compound the stupidity, right?
Yeah, I mean, cops can't lose.
Take the ticket,
yeah.
Do whatever the cop says, and we'll deal with it in court later on. But that's a fundamentally middle-class attitude. Right? That's an attitude, but that's an attitude that says, I can afford a lawyer. Mm-hmm. It's an attitude that says, I'm comfortable in the courts. It's an attitude that says that I'm comfortable with the administrative state. And if I'm a poor white kid who's fourth generation unemployed in West Virginia, right, and I make a living, if I do, right, scavenging used car parts wrecked cars off the side of the road, I'm picking, a circumstance, right? Those channels aren't quite as widely available. And so I'm less comfortable with that, and it's going to be dealt with in the moment with being a cop. And I think that one thing that we don't teach cops, and that we should be teaching cops, is, okay, so now I've got somebody who's non-compliant. This is a cultural marker for them. How do I gain their compliance?
Well, I mean, right now, you swarm the person.
Yeah, I know, but that's...
And New York City cops did their verbal judo, and there's something to that. But I really think this is more of a problem of scale. I think when you have to ask for community policing, that means your policing is just kind of this, apply online, go to the academy, and blah, blah, blah. And unlike the armed forces, there's not a surplus of people.
Yeah.
You can't run all volunteer police departments because there's so many people who want to do it.
Yeah.
There's nobody who wants to do it. And the responsiveness of cops is a departmental thing that it too is a product of the environment. I mean, I lived in LA and I've dealt with cops here. I go to Boston PD are fat slobs.
Oh yeah.
Compared. I go to Detroit and they snap at me immediately. You're not supposed to be here. Who do you think you are? I'm like, I'm visiting from LA. Don't give me that bullshit. Get out of here now.
Yeah.
If I catch you around here in 10 minutes, you're going downtown.
Yeah.
And it's like there are just embattled departments that are never going to get better. And you're never going to undo 30 years, 40 years of antagonism between the police department and that community. And there are exceptional people who come from the community, who speak the language of the community, who can negotiate that. And they're like an excellent football coach or an excellent principal. And you just can't herd those kinds of people. You just have to depend at some level that
they
you're
grow,
going to find those
they
gems.
come out. Yeah.
But that's the exception.
But I think that,
than the rule.
I mean, the problem, I think, in part goes to cars and radios, right? Which was Chief Parker's gift to LA, right? Which was the idea that we weren't going to have beat cops anymore, right? Because beat cops, take free lunches and, and are inherently kind of dirty and corrupt and blah, 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 blah. But that what we're going to do is we're going to have this sort of like the ability to swarm, move around the city quickly in cars marshaled by radios and with helicopters and all this, and we'll fight crime that way. And the problem is what that means is, in coin terms, I'm totally disconnected from the population.
Yeah.
I can't do coin like that.
It doesn't work.
And what you need, and I follow this guy, Patrick, I forget his last name, on Twitter, and he's a guy who was a CIA operative in Afghanistan, right? Who came back and decided to be a street cop. And he treats being a street cop like coin. And everybody's a neighbor, right? He talks to people as though they're neighbors. He's basically, his first question in every situation is, how would I solve this if I wasn't a cop? And, it appears, right? And again, I'm not looking at his data. I don't know him, right? But from what you read, it sounds like he's got a model that's a great model.
Yeah, there's also a guy out of Florida who does what he calls guardian cops, or the guardian principal of police.
Yeah. And
he's one of the guys who first identified the ambiguity of body cams.
Yeah.
That you can't necessarily trust them, and no matter what the body cams show, people's predisposition to cops is going to determine how they interpret whatever action they see. So yeah, I think that's definitely possible.
And so I think that the question is, how do you, and this keeps coming back to my whole question, which is how do you rebuild social capital in poor communities in America?
I think it may have something to do with the level of organized crime that you have and how much you let that exist and negotiate some kind of peace.
So,
if
so it's interesting because you're making an argument for the Blackstone Rangers model in Chicago in the 80s, where basically the city hired in the Blackstone Rangers as part of their community outreach in the face of racial unrest. And the Blackstone Rangers were basically free to keep being the gang they were as long as they kept it relatively peaceful.
Right. How'd that work out?
I need to go dig into that a little bit. It's a good question. I mean, I know anecdotally I have some very dear friends who live on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and they've lived there since the early 80s. And I used to literally not be able to get cabs down to where they live, right? Because the cab driver would assume I was going down to score drugs and just wouldn't take me.
Ray Jones.
Yeah. And there's a period of time when their block they joked it was the floor of the commodities exchange for heroin dealers in New York City. And it was just limos parked up and down the street. And you could leave $1,000 bicycle on your stoop for 3 days and no one would touch it.
Yep.
There's a murder every other day, right? There's a dead body, but it was never one of the residents.
Right.
There was no property crime, right? Because these guys enforced peace. And the problem is that got cleaned up and it became basically a shooting alley and then crime went through the roof and they couldn't get the attention of the city and it was a nightmare. So the question is, do you make deals with these groups?
It's interesting because obviously the Crips and Bloods have settled down here.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be an intifada every other year.
Oh yeah, I know.
But now, I don't know that there are no economics to support gang activity the way there used to be in the 80s.
Well, and I think the other part of it is that the people who were, wild and careless boys who've grown out of it, and their kids, if anything, or I don't know what the story is with the kids. But I think, the question is, did it actually work? And is it something that buys peace for the people who live in the white neighborhoods? Or is it something that actually can make a change in the poor communities?
I don't know. See, I was a big brother to a kid like Ice Cube.
Yeah.
If Ice Cube was my little brother, he would have got no respect. I'd have slapped him on the back of the head because I know he can't play ball.
Right.
Right? But as soon as I go away to college, he's the big man in the neighborhood, and he just wants to be a badass.
Yeah.
All right? And maybe that's part of my responsibility. But what's happened kind of generation after generation, is a younger generation gets props and mainstream money for dysfunctional behavior.
Yep.
So Bill Russell is not making as much money as, Ron Artest.
Right.
Artest, who's a legendary bad boy,
Yeah.
out of control, makes way more money in 5 years than Bill Russell did in his whole career. And Sly Stone didn't make as much money as Kendrick Lamar.
Right.
All right. So there's this big commercial enterprise that turns dysfunctional culture into this rebellious.
And we've mainstreamed dysfunction.
Yeah, it is.
Right. Well, I mean, the joke was always that the intent was that, poor black kids would get bused into white schools and they would learn sort of middle class behaviors. We grow this cohort of middle class black kids, and that was the model, right? Mm-hmm. And they didn't bring it; the media brought it. I mean, one of these days somebody needs to do a real excavation into the history of gangster rap, because I'm personally convinced that it was a mainstream media creation more than a street phenomenon.
Well, I was somewhat in the middle of that, and Ice-T is actually a real historian on that.
Yeah.
And, late 80s, I was in that club scene.
Yeah.
And there were parties, underground parties at Lafayette Park.
Mm-hmm.
That's where Parsons is.
Yeah.
So the Parsons has this giant building.
You know it.
And I'd go to parties like that, and it would be, the slumming West Siders and kids from the Valley and the art students.
Yeah.
And they would love Ice-T and the Bad Boys. And so they were getting the authentic.
Right. It's a little dangerous, and a couple of them got robbed every time. So that made it sort of.
And that's what happened. And at the time, when Quincy Jones was like, I don't know, we're not going to let this happen. And Quincy Jones was a gatekeeper in Hollywood recording industry. He had to literally kiss his ass. There was like, well, is rap here to stay or not? And I think by 91, 92, especially after the riot, it was like, now a whole bunch of money wants to go and do this.
Yeah.
And so there was a rumor when I was living in Brooklyn that, South Africans are putting money into producers because they believe this stuff is catastrophic for black mentality, and they want to profit off of this. And you had Rick Rubin, white guy, he says, well, what is he doing in this?
Yeah.
And so it was like, who was producing what music, what radio stations are playing it, and it was a small enough, closely knit enough thing where, there were real questions about whose money this is, whose laundered money this is, and what these labels are doing. And Gangsta took off.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons, a lot of it to do with a kind of punk sensibility.
Yeah.
That this is the new black
The
punk.
DIY kind of.
Yeah, this is the new black punk. And then that became the big commercial success. So for all the artistic things that hip hop, for me personally, that I thought it was going to be, like A Tribe Called Quest, with what's his name on the bass? I want to say Tony Williams.
No, it's not Tony Williams. I think it's.
I know
who you're talking about.
And it was like, is this going to happen or not? And then you had groups like Cypress Hill and Onyx on the other stand, was just like headbanging, slamming stuff. And I was just like, oh, they're. And rap didn't get originally enough support actually from black radio, so that they had any influence. So there was just a giant critical lapse in the late 80s, and nobody really took it as seriously as an art as it could be, and there was no other impetus for it as an art form other than the money.
Well, it had been very I mean, think about the last poets, right? Back in the 70s, right?
Yeah.
You know, it had been a very kind of niche kind of form, and then it suddenly became blown up. But what's interesting to me is there's this sort of cultural line I can draw, right? Where what you start seeing is the same kind of dysfunction, right? I'm using that word pointedly, right? That existed in young, poor black kids, in young, poor brown kids, and in young, poor white kids, and then in young, middle-class white kids, and middle-class black kids, and middle-class brown kids.
Yeah.
And what we now have is a world in which, you know, somebody who lives in this neighborhood thinks nothing of having a baby without a dad. Right?
Yeah.
And 30 years ago, right, that would have been like a big fucking deal.
Yeah, I mean, you know, 30 years ago it was just say no.
Right.
Now it's just say whatever.
Whatever. And so what we've got is we're, you know, in a sense we're draining the social capital of the whole culture.
Yeah.
Right now, which worries me because it's one of those things that's hard to top up.
But you know, there's so much delicious counterculture that still exists. Which is not necessarily counterculture, it's alt.
Yeah, but you know, here's my deal with alt and countercultures in general. And I'm gonna call bullshit on myself because I'm gonna point out that the reality is that cat is nuzzling your tripod. You know, most interesting things started out as countercultural.
Yeah.
Right? And
we'll take a break.
Yeah, let's take a break and put the cat inside. Come on, Gums, let's go inside. So, how's working?
No, good. So you're talking about the difference between alt and counterculture.
Right. So the issue to me with alt is they're hobbies, and they're not something that I think turns the dial of how the median person in the country lives in a significant way. And they're hobbies that sometimes become consumer goods.
Yeah.
Right. And my concern is that we've got to move the median dial.
We have monetized entire cultures.
Yeah, absolutely do.
And we take those cultures seriously because we're relativists and we're consumerists.
Yep. And once I can take that culture and define it as a set of consumer items.
Yep.
Right? William Gibson wrote a whole book, and it was really funny. The MacGuffin in his book was the design for a bunch of clothing that had been developed for some super secret special forces group. And his taste hunter, his cool hunter kind of heroes, right, realized that basically the masculine trend in the modern era was anchored on special forces operators. Right, and so everybody today, and I'm not mocking you totally,
no,
wears clunky watches.
Absolutely true.
Right, they wear clunky watches, they wear paracord bracelets, they wear cargo pants, they wear ball caps, right? And you know, and that's kind of the center of mass. And so what it's about is it's about the consumerization of the culture without actually any of the stuff that goes into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what we worry about, right? What I worry about a ton is there's a great sort of thread on Facebook and Twitter about the moms on the Upper West Side in Manhattan losing their shit because the city moved roughly 1,000 homeless people into 2 hotels there. Right? And this relatively small neighborhood, like around Lincoln Center, to give you a sense of like what the neighborhood's like.
I probably know where the apartment building is.
Yeah, exactly, too. Right? Is now full of people who are standing on the stairs of buildings, jerking off, shooting up, fucking other people, taking shits in the street, doing all the stuff that basically fucked up homeless people do.
Yeah.
Right? But now they're doing it like in your face, in your lap. Right? And
I know that neighborhood.
And part of what I'm realizing is that our politics in the 50s and 60s was designed around optimizing for this community, for the family. right? Where dad went off to work in aerospace and mom stayed home and raised the kids, and the
Yep.
kids went to school and did well,
Yep.
so they could have jobs like dad or be mom
Yep.
and go from there,
Yeah.
right? We're now beginning to optimize cities around highly dysfunctional, fucked up people.
Well, certainly Portland and Seattle.
Well, Los Angeles to an extent.
Yeah, LA is very interesting because I started watching this show called Travels with My Father, and it's some British cunt is dancing his dad around.
Yeah.
And the first episode is Dad, I'm a comedian now, and I have to live in Hollywood or Hollywood environments, and I'd like you and Mommy to come live out here with me. And so, he takes him around to these stereotypical LA West Side kinds of things.
Right.
The first stop is naked yoga.
Right.
So, but there's a Los Angeles that everybody thinks they know that is very oriented around the industry, and there's the real LA, right? It's like if you know a beer pub in San Pedro,
Yeah.
then I think you know something about LA. And the place is so massive. LA is so massive.
But it's more than that. But what's happened is that and again, right? I'm not putting a moral weight around this yet, right? What I'm talking about just from a civic functioning point of view. We're basically designing the city around people who aren't the majority of people in the city, and they're not the people who do the kind of economic and social and cultural activity that keeps the city what it is. We're designing the city around your comedian friend after he gets his 5th HBO show,
right,
and lives up in the Hollywood Hills with his parents in the guest house, and around the 19 Mexican families that support him, right, by providing him with a cook and a gardener and a driver and people that work on his house and all this other stuff, and the 4 black families that are staffing one of his clubs, right, none of whom make more than $30,000 or $40,000 a year. And and then we're designing it as a place where we want the homeless people to be as comfortable and themselves as they can possibly be, and that's kind of an indicator to me, right? I've been active in homeless stuff for 30 years, and there are these 3 kind of conflicting imperatives that I see in the homeless issue that we all face. The first is, what's the right thing to do for homeless people themselves, most importantly, right? The second one is, how do we mitigate the impacts they have on the communities they're in? And third is, how do we stop creating them?
Interesting. Well, I think it's clear, and I have some personal experience with what requires a certain amount of institutionalization of somebody who falls off the rails. And that's something that is a barrier that is kind of like, well, it's almost like fire. It's like, don't call 911 unless your house is actually on fire.
Right.
But there's no fire safety. There's nothing
There's no
else.
building inspection. There's
Right.
nobody who comes by to make sure your sprinklers work.
Right.
There's nobody who does anything except, hey, you're on your own until the house actually catches fire.
Right. Exactly.
And so
that's a matter of priorities in funding. It's a matter of limited facilities.
Yeah,
and limited abilities, I think, as well.
But part of it is that the facilities are, I remember in California when we shut them down.
Yeah, I know.
And it was an unholy alliance between the Republicans who didn't want to spend the money and the liberals who'd seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and believed that what's his name was a hero, and that Nurse Ratched was like the evil villain.
Right.
And and on a fundamental level, there was this like, yeah, be free, man, get on the street, do yourself. So a certain percentage of you turn into Charles Manson. We'll just sort of suck that up as part of the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and I've said this to you and other folks before, the lady who ran the homeless group that I worked with in Venice, St. Joseph Center, sort of bucketed homeless people into 3 rough buckets, and I still hold on this.
Yeah, give me that.
A third of them are you and me, and we're just out of luck.
Okay.
Lose my job, right? House gets foreclosed on. I come over and I stay with you for a couple weeks, but like you're like, hey Mark, like you timed out here.
Yeah.
Right. So then I go and I stay in my car for a while, and then I get ticketed and my car gets towed.
Yeah.
And I've got like, I'm out of sofas to stay on. I've got no money. I've got no resources. I'm just the pachinko ball going down the machine.
Yeah.
If you can catch those people and put a floor under them and stabilize them, a roof over their heads and stabilize them for 3 months,
Yeah.
you never see them again.
Yeah.
Right.
Stabilization.
So those are the ones that are like the gold nuggets in this whole flu, right?
Gotcha.
The second group are people who are basically clinically insane, and they need treatment, and they need care. And we have decided, for whatever highfalutin moral purpose it suits us, that having them live out on the street, self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, right, and be basically feral, is a better solution for them than being institutionalized and medicated against their will.
Crazy.
And I can't get my head around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? The third group are what, and I use the term hobos. They're people who've made kind of an ideological decision that I can sleep on the fucking beach. I can smoke pot all day long. Right? I can go to a shelter, clean up, right? Pick up a check. We can hang out for a couple of weeks. Right? Roll a couple fat ones, I'm gone. Right?
Yep.
And you people who live the straight life, you're suckers.
Right.
There've always been people like that.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Right? And my kind of belief is that the solution to group number 2 is we need to rebuild mental care institutions, and we need to rethink the notion of involuntary treatment. Right? To some extent, it's a dangerous thing.
I think there's I mean, in where I grew up in Crenshaw,
Yeah.
which when I was born, it wasn't necessarily, it was not a black community, but it was mixed.
Yeah.
But anyway, Crenshaw Boulevard, I would catch the bus to school before I had enough money to buy a 10-speed. And every once in a while, there would be a black gentleman driving by in a brand new Mercedes-Benz. And I'm like, where did he come from?
Yeah.
There's not a funeral today.
Yeah.
This dude is rich. Where is he coming from? Where he's going? And there's an old movie called Drop Squad, and a Living Color, and their first album said, "Tell me how to get to your America." And there's this kind of idea that I think it still exists, where people say, "I wish I knew, like for a day, how the other people live.
Oh yeah.
If I could get out of here for like a week or 2 weeks,
Yep.
and be in this transformative place where I can get the scoop from people who actually know, man, that'd be great. Because all these fools around here, they're not doing me any good. And I got to deal with these knuckleheads. And I'm just hustling, and I don't know what the other side is
Yeah.
like. And if you had that, it would reduce a lot of contempt from the people who actually do make it. Because it's like, I got out of that ghetto and I'm never going back. There's an old song called Tobacco Road
Oh yeah, I know the song.
by Lou Rawls.
I know the song.
And he said, I'm never going
Come
back.
back.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is, and let me do a sidebar on that. I'm going to come back to homelessness for a minute. So LA, I'm willing to bet that if I...
But my point there is that the second group, they need drop squad.
Yeah.
There needs somebody around here, which is like kind of what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
The Kung Fu Santa Claus
Yeah.
is to go around dropping presents and kicking ass.
Yeah.
And that's what cops are not doing.
No.
And that's what cops and social workers, the idea
Right.
of defund.
Well, it's the third group, not the second group you're talking about. The second group are people who are just chemically crazy.
Yeah, but I think hobos are all right.
Yeah,
I think hobos and winos, we can deal with them because there's actually a fourth group, which is the predators, who are amongst those guys, the drug dealers.
Those are almost all out of the third group. They're people who found a way to monetize the people they're with.
Okay.
Right? They're the people who set up tents as bordellos on Skid Row.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And and those guys, yeah, they totally exploit it.
The dangerous hobos.
The dangerous hobos.
Okay, gotcha.
And so my thing is, we look at people who are, you know, kind of like mentally ill.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me come back to your point for a second. I want to talk about how do you find a ladder out.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at the Tita title of this house, I am willing to bet that somewhere in it says the owner of the house has to be white. Right? Through most of LA until it was deemed illegal in the early 60s. So this house may be too new for that.
Yeah.
Right? Basically, there were deed restrictions.
I know.
And the only place that you as a middle-class black person could buy property was in South Central LA.
I know.
Or Compton.
And Lomas and Nettleton was the mortgage company that
That's
would
right.
loan to blacks.
They're the black realtors, black mortgage companies.
Yeah.
So the two things that happened from that were, one, you had black institutions. Right? One of the things that I was always stunned by as a kid, and I think you and I talked about this when I went to grad school and studied urban economics, is that the multiplier effect, the respending of a dollar in a poor black community is like zero.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Dollar in, dollar out.
Yeah.
Right? Go to a poor Hasidic Jewish community and it's like 35.
Yeah.
Right? Go to a poor Hispanic community and it's like 5 or 6.
Right.
Right? And what you don't have is what Spike Lee called out the, like, why don't we own the score? Why do the Koreans own the score?
Right.
And so what you had, because there was this compressed deed restriction, the entrepreneurial class of black people were entrepreneurial, and they served other black people.
Right.
And I've never understood, and it's a cultural mystery to me, right? Jewish people I know, Hispanic people I know, Asian people I know will prioritize doing business with a lanceman, right?
Yeah.
There's two stores. There's a store that's owned by a random white guy and a store that's owned by a brown guy, and I'm a brown guy, so I'm gonna shop here.
Yep. Yep.
Right?
Well, see, that happens in certain places. Right? I'm absolutely sure it happens in Atlanta. I'm 90% sure it happens in Baltimore. I'm 90% sure it happens in Dorchester,
Yeah.
Boston. And a lot of those communities have not reached a critical mass where it's attractive for college graduates to go back.
Right, I can go back and there's a career there that's the equivalent of going to work for IBM.
But there is in Atlanta,
Yeah.
for sure.
But I think what's happened is that as we lifted the and I'll use the word chains, and not advisedly, like the chains of zoning restrictions and segregation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And said basically, okay, you're a smart middle class thinking black guy,
Mm-hmm.
go work for IBM,
Mm-hmm.
right? Move to Redondo Beach,
Right.
right? You had this exodus, right? And the people who got left behind were the people who didn't have that ladder up and out.
Yeah.
And rebuilding that ladder, and it's now become for me a critical problem for everybody.
Well, see, here's the thing. I think when you look at it historically, and I think about the history of the San Fernando Valley.
Yeah.
These were war vets coming back.
Yeah.
GI Bill.
Yep.
FHA loans and all that
Yep.
stuff. That was a mainstream that most black Americans missed out.
Yeah, they were denied it.
Right. So, and there was a big crossover and integration that took the guts and thinking people out of previously black-owned institutions.
Yep.
And there was a point at which, you really had a choice, and that was in the late 70s, early 80s, where it was like, oh, I could integrate or I could try to recycle black.
Yeah.
And I think the populations are too big and too diverse for any of that to carry through.
Well, and I think the rewards for integration are too great.
Yeah.
I mean, how much am I going to sacrifice my family to do, quote, the right thing?
Right.
And so the dilemma becomes, right? And so let me go back to homelessness, because it ties back to this thing I'm going to talk about with poor black and brown communities, is the idea that, to me, there's a two-sided edge on this. One is the homeless people were kept contained in relatively poor, politically powerless communities.
Mm-hmm.
Now they're all over.
Yeah.
So now the middle class people, the women, the soccer moms in the Upper West Side of Manhattan have to deal with it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And the other side of it is that the people they damage are the marginal store owner, right? The woman who's basically making a go of it in some little store or little restaurant that she started. And the homeless guy who camps out in front of her place, kills her business. It's not going to kill Robinson Helicopter. It's not going to kill, right? You know, pick a big company someplace, right? But her business gets screwed by that. In the same sense that her business gets screwed by petty crime. And that as we turn the dials in our cities to make them more homeless friendly and bluntly more petty crime friendly, right? The people who get burned by that are the poorer people.
Yes, I agree. It's interesting because I definitely know that different cities have different tolerance for people living on their streets.
Oh yeah.
All right. So if I go to Salt Lake City, none.
Yeah.
It's clean, and they're not going to change. I go to Seattle.
Everywhere.
And the basic economics of the situation speak to poor people living on poor real estate.
But that's always been true.
But there is a conceit that wealthy, affluent people can afford to supplement, you know that part of Skid Row, downtown LA, is zoned for the missions.
Yep.
All right, and that's theirs. All right, every accolade that I get as an advocate for the homeless and a philanthropist is me putting money into
those
my midnight mission,
right,
which is right there, and that's my social capital. But it's not solving anything but my ego.
Well,
it's making me as a rich person look to be very.
It's everything. I stopped giving when I did work with this homeless group in the 80s. I stopped giving money to people on the street. Ever since grad school, right? I've always had a little bit of money. I've never been, rich, but I've always had, cash in my pocket. I would set aside a certain amount every week for handout money.
Yeah.
Right. I'm in Berkeley, and I'd give away $2 or $3 a week. Right. I'd give away $5 a week, whatever I give away, because you feel good. It's like, here, man.
Yeah.
Have a burger.
Yeah.
Right. And it gives you that little dopamine rush. Right. And the problem is, once I realized what it did to the people I was giving it to, I stopped doing it.
Yeah.
And I don't give money to anybody on the street anymore.
Trade, not aid.
And so it's one of these things where we got to come up with some mechanism, right, to deal with, homeless people. We got to come up with some way for poor communities to build ladders up and out. To me, the poor communities, it starts with schools. And I'm all about just burning the schools down and starting over.
I think I'm with that. I just don't think schools are teaching the appropriate curriculum for life in the city.
Well, they don't. And I also think that schools aren't expansive enough in terms of the time they take out of the kid's life. I think that schools need to, if I'm a kid living at home with a single mom with 4 other kids, right, the school needs to keep me for longer so she can A, have a break, and B, have a job.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And the school can start giving me some of the learnings that she can't do it. She's got 5 kids at home. She's barely getting dinner on every night.
You know what I think would work? And of course it's very controversial, which is elimination of the minimum wage. Because if I've done it several times where I see a hobo.
Yeah.
Because hobo's got his own bicycle.
Right.
I'm like, could you drop this in the mailbox for me? I'll give you $2.
Yeah.
And I know that's $10 an hour.
Right.
For him. But we're not monetizing people.
No.
We're not giving people basic things that they could do for money and paying attention to that economy.
Well, but we're gonna soon, because I think that what you're gonna see is you're gonna see a whole rise in a private service economy. You're gonna see Downton Abbey in America again soon.
You're gonna have to.
Fuck, that sucks so hard.
Yeah, but the alternative is the favela. The alternative is you're gonna go live in this unzoned, unincorporated
There's gotta be a better way.
area.
There's gotta be a better way.
What cities in America approach that? Because if you go to Detroit, where it's been burned down, things that were burned down 30, 40, 50 years ago, 50 years ago, still haven't recovered.
I know.
Now, I was this close to buying something in Grosse Pointe Woods.
Yeah, I know.
Because I could get a mansion.
Get a mansion for $200,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I said, you know what? This is not a neighborhood. It's not going to be a neighborhood for another 20 years.
So the question is, I don't know, this is, I think, the next talk. This is the to be continued. What's the plan for? What are some options for dealing with this? What are some ideas for dealing with this?
All right. Yeah. Well, that's been great.
Always great, man. I love talking to you. I miss you.
Cool.
In our socially distanced way.
Yeah, the wind is blowing, so I have never smelled his breath for this whole.
Wait, you can normally smell my breath? I'm gonna go upstairs and brush my teeth.
Thank you for listening to American Wag. Join us again, won't you?